What is up, everybody? My name is Rebecca Johnson. I'm one of the co-hosts of Supergirl Radio, and we are gathering together this live stream, this live and wired stream, to do a take two on the Superpowered, the DC story documentary available on Max if you haven't already seen it. So previously, in the last week, in the last live and wired stream, we had some audio issues. So we are going to try again. And I believe that Morgan has fixed that. We've resolved the issue. It was an operating system situation. So always make sure your OSs are up to date. So something was up about that in terms of StreamYard connectivity. So just always be aware of what your operating system is doing. It's a good lesson for us all. I knew it was time for me to get a new laptop when I guess I had my laptop was something like 11 years, my previous laptop. And I knew it was time to get a new one because I could not update the operating system. It was so old, I was unable to update the operating system. So the OS will tell you when things are not workable. So yeah, New Rachel in the chat says, hopefully no technical difficulties this time. I agree. We'll see what happens. we'll take a shot and see what happens. I see Morgan down below, but I'm not seeing. There's a picture. Let me know when you're ready to go. Yes. Okay. Good. Let's try to. Oh, why is the background not up? Oh, it's because I just updated the background. So my apologies for not having that. Now we're not. Now it's not about a boring background, a black background. Got some sort of visual.
All right.
Oh, you sound lovely.
I'm back. That was stressful last week. It turns out that despite not wanting to switch from Windows 10 to Windows 11, I had no choice. Fun. I was like, all right, let me update every part of my computer except the operating system. And they were like, LOL, no.
I haven't had a Windows PC in a long time. Is it similar to like a Mac system where it takes a long time to update the OS?
It took
Does
a
it
second.
take a while?
Yeah,
it takes a while.
It took a second. We had a friend help troubleshoot, and he was like, I think you're gonna have to update to 11. And I was like, no.
Well,
11's fine.
You seem to have fixed it, but I'm sure it's taking a lot to get used to. I don't know if it looks different.
It's a little different. Like all the things are in different places. The start is in the middle of the screen for some reason.
That's weird.
Why not the corner? Windows. I don't know.
Was that broken? Did it need to be fixed?
It did not. No. It was doing fine.
People had been used to that for like 20 something years.
It was doing fine in the place we all knew it was before.
So that's a reason to change it. Well,
course.
okay. Morgan, do you have the doc?
I do have the doc.
I felt really proud of myself because after we postponed for a week to kind of resolve the audio issues, I came up with some questions I thought were good. So we'll see what the discussion leads to. But okay, I guess we should go ahead and get started, and we'll be talking about Superpowered, the DC story.
McGurk! I love
Not mess
typing.
with my Google Docs, Meeksy.
Supergirl Radio is going live every night of the week. How do you like it? Is becoming a human burrito a plus or a minus? I don't know. It does seem snug.
I mean, they say you are what you eat.
Kira. I love that.
So I do a podcast called Supergirl Radio, and one of our segments is Lena Luthor, Boardroom or Ballroom, because
She looks like a boss in this coat.
Nasty Luthor like a different Luthor? It's not just Lena being mean?
No.
Helen Slater here. So fun to know that you're hosting a podcast called Supergirl Radio.
Welcome to Supergirl Radio, your source for all things related to the CW Supergirl TV series and the character of Kara Zor-El. My name is Rebecca Johnson.
I'm Morgan Glennon.
And we are live and wired on the DC TV Podcast YouTube channel and the Supergirl Radio Facebook page to discuss the Max documentary Superpowered, the DC story. This is a Supergirl podcast, and she is a DC Comics character, so we felt like this was appropriate. And
Check.
and we both love documentaries.
We do.
So this felt like just right up our alley on this one. So let's just get right into it to discuss Superpowered, the DC story, which you can find on Max if you would like to also watch it. The episode description, the series description from Max reads, quote, over 3 action-packed hours, this docuseries offers a comprehensive inside look at DC's iconic characters, cultural impact, and enduring legacy, unquote. So I guess I shouldn't call it a documentary. It's not really a documentary film. It's a docuseries.
It's a docuseries.
So I guess that will lead into one of my questions, but I want to start with the question because I had expectations before going into this. I was curious if you also had expectations. Before you hit play on this docuseries on Max, what did you expect Superpowered, the DC story what story did you think that was gonna tell?
I didn't know. I was like, I don't know. I was hoping that I would learn more about the early years of DC, because that's kind of like a place that I don't know a ton of. Like the history, I know a little bit about Superman's history. I know a little bit about Wonder Woman's history. All the Batman stuff was actually really new to me.
Really?
Yeah, which I somehow, and not to Warner Brothers credit, have managed to avoid knowing much about the creation of Batman, Warner Brothers' favorite and only character. And so that was really interesting to me that it was like kind of co-created by two different creators, but one of them really got the short end of the stick. I think it was and now I'm gonna get his name wrong and feel shame. Bill Finger?
Yes, Bill Finger
was the writer behind it. And
he was the artist, and he also came up with a lot of the concepts of Batman that we think of today. A lot of the villains, a lot of the world building. I think he might have come up with the Batmobile.
Oh my god!
The Joker, all those things, like very Batman-y things. Bill Finger was responsible for, and it was not something that Bob Kane, the co-creator, would admit until after Bill Finger died. Which is a real jerkish thing to do.
Yeah, pretty messed up. Bob Kane kind of just was like, "Yeah, I did a Batman," and
all by myself.
Feels like
just me, Bob Kane.
Excuse me, maybe I also did a Batman. And you're like, no, it's just me, Bob. So I thought that was really interesting to get sort of a perspective on the Batman origin story. I wish they had spent a little bit more time on the Wonder Woman origin story, because when I was in college, I took like a over the summer, I took like a media studies class, and we had to read some book or essay or something about like the creation of Wonder Woman. And man, that story is drama. And I was like, yeah, let's get a little bit more of that in there. And then they kind of skimmed over it. But the
You
fact
mean the William Moulton Moulton, what is his
yes,
name? William
William
Moulton
Moulton
Marsden?
Marsden, I
I think
think,
that's the
or
right order.
Marston. But yeah, he had, I believe he was married, but he also had a girlfriend, and they all kind of lived together.
There
And
is a movie about this that I
yes, I
watched.
think it's called Professor Marston and the Wonder Woman.
Yeah, and I watched it and I was like, "Oh, this is kind of X-rated." I
Oh,
did not know
really?
this going into it.
I have been wanting to watch that movie.
Be forewarned when you watch it. It is not.
Not
It is not
family friendly.
It's not family
Okay,
friendly.
okay,
It's not
good to
safe
know.
for work. It
Good
is
to know.
very adult. So,
Oh,
so I just
he lived quite an adult life.
he really truly did.
But yeah, the two women in his life did contribute to Wonder Woman. So even though Wonder Woman was created by a man, it was a man who had lots of women around. One could argue too many.
Maybe
I don't
too
know.
many. I mean,
Maybe
that's,
maybe too many. Listen, works for them. God bless. But yeah, I remember reading, because I didn't like, this was back in college. I didn't know anything about Wonder Woman, reading and being like, and then another one?
Yeah.
Scandal. Yeah, and I know they did touch on it a little bit. They were like, yeah, the rope tying up thing, like that was just like a thing he had.
Oh, well, what's interesting is that they tried to sort of with the Wonder Woman stuff, they sort of tried to sugarcoat it a little bit, like, oh, but it was mostly about women's suffrage. It was mostly about the iconic symbolism of women's suffrage imagery, and I was like, was it though? Was it? I don't know. After watching that movie, I didn't get a lot of women's suffrage out of that movie.
I do remember from like vaguely from the college like essays that I read that he was very like, there should be more women in charge of things. Like he was very pro woman, even though, he had two significant others. He was like, I'm so pro woman, I want multiple of them. Listen, sir, trying. But like I do think that he in general, for a man of his time, and also apparently his inclinations, he was like kind of, into women's rights and things like that. So he layered those things into Wonder Woman stories. Now, was he always a perfect example of it? I would guess not. I didn't see any of those girls' names on that Wonder Woman, did I? So
there's no co-creator there.
Interesting, sir. He's like, women should rule everything. You're like, do you want to put your wife or your girlfriend's name on this book? Well, maybe not that. But it was, I thought, for me, that the part of this documentary that was most interesting to me was the early stuff, like the stuff from like the creation of Superman, the creation of Batman, the creation of Wonder Woman, and then like the radio serials and things like that. When we started getting to the current day, it started getting like a little weird and sweaty and awkward. But the past stuff I thought was pretty interesting. So I went in going like, I hope I learn more about the past, and I feel like I did, but I don't know that I learned a lot about the present.
So that was my expectation, is I wanted to know the history of the comics. I wanted it specifically. I guess that was my putting that expectation on the docuseries and not just going for the ride. I wanted to know about the comics, and that first episode, which is called, what is that first episode called? I wrote it down. The Hero's Journey. So there's 3 episodes of this docuseries, and the first one really does hit on the creation of DC Comics. It talks about the people who actually were, I mean, it even goes back to Major Malcolm Wheeler Nicholson, who basically was the guy who created the company that would eventually become DC Comics. So it goes all the way.
Didn't it not go so well for that poor guy either?
Okay, so I did make a note about this. He was forced out, and the company was taken over during the time when Superman was about to hit the stands. So that was a very inopportune time for him to be shoved out the door.
Absolutely brutal.
He probably saw that Superman mania the next decade, and he was like, "What the heck, man?" So
He'd probably just like want to not look. He'd be like, I can't deal with
get
it.
that child in the Superman shirt away from me. I don't want to look
Get
at
him
him
away.
anymore.
It's like, why does he always start crying when he sees a small child in a Superman shirt? Oh, the money. Yeah, no, that was brutal. That was the first part in the documentary. It was like, ooh, that's brutal. And then Bill Finger was the second part where I was like, oh, come on.
Yeah, funny thing about Bill Finger, they did not mention that Batman v Superman: Dawn of Justice was the first. I think
Ooh.
not even just the first movie. I think it was the first time that Bill Finger was given credit for co-creating Batman.
That's awesome.
So we'll talk about more about the Snyderverse later because I have a lot of thoughts about that. But yeah, so I was a little disappointed when it sort of went in a direction that started to go away from the comics for a large portion of it. That was mostly in the third episode, which was titled A Better Tomorrow. Now, what I thought was nice about the documentary is that it would sometimes tell the stories of some creators. Like it would tell the stories of some of the people in the past, and it would tell some of the people in the future. So or not the future. You can't tell stories about people in the future unless you are in the Legion of Superheroes.
Then maybe I'm using my powers for documentaries.
But they were telling stories about people in the present and the things that they were working on and how they were inspired by things in the past. And I thought all of that was great. But I guess my questions that I was wrestling with, and Morgan, I was wondering if you could help me figure this out, is I was trying to figure, because all documentaries kind of go in with a goal, a purpose, a story you want to tell, a perspective on something that you want to take. So what do you think the goal or purpose of this docuseries was?
I did find myself asking myself, who is this for? And I don't know that I came out of it with a clear answer, because I feel like if the answer was like, this is for DC super fans, I feel like a lot of the information is not like that surprising. Like a lot of the information, if you're a really big DC fan, you probably already know it. Like I don't think that there are any like shocking revelations in here. And I kind of feel like by saying like this is going to be a holistic view of DC entertainment, all DC for 85 years. We're going to make it 3 episodes. It's just not possible to pack that much. It's like I can't remember what episode it was in now, but like they were like, and then video games, and I was like, sir, no. No, we got to draw a line somewhere. We're already talking comics. We're already talking 85 years of comics. We're talking about TV shows. We're talking about movies. You got to stop at video game. You got to stop. But they were like, I can't stop. I won't stop. Injustice. And I was like, oh my God. And it's not like the video game stuff wasn't cool, but it's like in 3 hours, you're trying to encapsulate 85 years of history across like 5 different mediums. It's just like not possible.
I sort of got the feeling that this was like a WB sizzle reel. That it was like a piece of promotional material.
It's interesting. I was like, I wonder if there are any reviews of this.
We are the only one.
Surprise, there are actually. I was like, oh, Rotten Tomatoes has weighed in on this? Crap.
No, I'm sure it's terrible.
So I clicked in on some of them, and that was actually some of the critiques that a couple of and now I'm of course gonna forget who it was that was writing. But somebody said the exact same thing, which is like, it feels like a sizzle reel, like a corporate synergy sizzle reel that like, I don't know exactly, who this is like marketed to, but it feels like it's marketed to WB executives.
Look at all the amazing things we've
done so much, and perhaps we should have more budget.
So that brings me to a point that I wanted to talk about, because if I was going to, after watching this, I came up with a documentary concept idea that I would love to see them pursue. They never will. But if I could tell a story about DC Comics, what I would be interested in is the amount of executives who have made terrible decisions, and ultimately it was the creative people behind the stories and the movies and the characters that made them who they are. Because in a lot of instances in the documentary, credit to WB, they at least talked about the things that were bad. Well, some of them.
I feel like they were willing to admit things were bad in the
past.
But I mean, now
Yes.
things are rock and roll, Black Adam, baby. That was, I will say, one of the more awkward moments of this documentary. And I told you this already last week when we actually were able to communicate with each other offline. But the awkward moments were like hearing them like try to hype up projects that have already flopped at the time I was watching it.
Yes.
So they were like, and now a new generation starts with Black Adam. And it's like The Rock is like, I feel like I'm gonna be all over this universe. And like you're like, no, you're not. And then there's like Zachary
it's gonna be Shazam too, Fury of the Gods.
Levi was like, I don't want to be like, I don't want to be over dramatic, but this is the best movie ever created. And you're like, oh, Zachary. It's not going well for you in the future. But that was also one of my issues with the documentary, is that like they would have some of these great talking heads from like comic book writers and creators and stuff like that, and then they would have the people from the TV shows where it was very clearly a press junket, and they were very clearly just pulling out a quote that vaguely made sense in the context, but it wasn't like they were talking to them going like, hey, actor who's in this show, like looking back at the legacy, how do you feel? It was like, no, this is a press junket from 5 years ago, and Melissa Benoist is like, Supergirl is super. And you're like, cool. I mean, the whole show's over now. I bet she would have some interesting things to say, like in a recollection kind of
post-season 6
situation. But she was like, hope, help, and compassion for all. And they were like, and that's all the time we have for Supergirl. Moving on. And you're like, no, wait. But that was like the situation with like the Rock clip and like the Zachary Levi clip, where like clearly from a press junket that they were doing for the movie before it opens. And so you have this awkward moment where you're like, ooh, uh-oh.
Yeah, a lot of it was file footage. I think probably the only new interviews were like, my guess is Jim Lee, Patty Jenkins. Although Patty Jenkins, that might have been Wonder Woman.
That could have been for 84. Yeah. I went back and forth on like, is the Patty Jenkins one new or is that old? There were a couple of them that I did feel like were new. So like, I can't pronounce her name, Janelle, I think, and I cannot remember her last name either.
Jeanette Kahn?
I think so. Yeah.
Or or Joelle Jones.
Joelle Jones. Yeah, I felt like hers was new. And also they had that B-roll footage of her drawing something, so that made me feel like they weren't just like pulling something out of the archive. But Greg Berlanti, maybe, I felt like his was maybe new because he was like talking about a couple of different aspects of the DC story. So that made me feel like, okay, they actually got Berlanti to like sit down with them for, maybe a half an hour and talk. But so many of the interviews did feel like they were just sliced from some other promotional thing, which is not necessarily the worst, but then it starts to feel like everybody's just kind of talking about a completely separate thing and they're just kind of editing it together. Like the editing was doing a lot of heavy lifting here.
Yeah. I thought it was interesting because there were some interviews that looked like they were, I don't know, 1990s. It looked like an old clip from Space Ghost Coast to Coast. I don't know if you know what I mean. Like that, if you watch Space Ghost Coast to Coast and you saw an interview on the TV that Space Ghost was talking to, that's what it sort of looked like. There were two of them that stuck out to me with Julius Schwartz and Carmine Infantino. And that's all they showed of them. And they are two of the biggest creative people behind DC Comics. And they spent 2 seconds on those guys. And I thought that was so unbelievably strange. And they did that, I think, for a lot of that, where they would just kind of mention people and they would skim on. And I know they didn't have a lot of time, but that's where the structure of it, I felt like it could have been a little more focused on something. I don't the only thing I can think of that they wanted to achieve with this was to pump up WB and DC in a way that made them look good. That's the only thing I can think of.
And I will applaud them for mentioning things where it'd be like, you know, in the 70s or something, we were at, you know, DC was out of step with like the cultural conversation, and like Marvel was swooping in with like comics that were dealing with like the realities of what was happening in the culture and the politics of the time, and DC was still kind of stuck in the past, or like things where they were talking about like the ways that DC had kind of fallen down on like diversity or having like different characters from different backgrounds, and how they were trying to add that in, and like talking about Milestone Comics, which I had never heard of before, but that was like an imprint that they did focusing on like creators of color, and how they've brought that back. Stuff like that. I like that they were willing to be like, hey, DC wasn't the best all the time. But then you got to episode 3 and they're like, well, it's now we're in the current day, and obviously we've made no mistakes currently. We've only done good things recently. Don't look over there. No. Recently, it's been great, and we've never made a mistake. And so it kind of felt like weird, like they were willing to admit where DC made mistakes in the past, or like, oh, DC should have jumped in
because it wasn't them. Nobody then is working for them
and
now.
I can understand that. Like as a documentarian, you know, it's going on Max, which is owned by Warner Brothers Discovery. You don't want to have like the documentary that's like DC now is in shambles, right? Like you can't.
Isn't that a much more interesting story?
It is a much more interesting.
I think it
story.
is because they mentioned Harry Donenfeld, who was DC president, and they talk about how he started his career publishing racy magazines, that he escaped obscenity charges from the FBI, that he sought a more legitimate enterprise to exploit, and took control of DC because of it. Then they talk about the 1969 corporate takeover by Warner Communications, and how the takeover was targeted. The takeover targeted DC for its licensing potential, but not its comics. Talked about I've got more. This is so much more interesting to me. That the DC president Jack Leibowitz forced out a number of DC Comics legends like Bill Finger, who died destitute in 1974. They talk about how when Warner Communications took over, that the family atmosphere of DC surrendered to corporate structure, that Warner Communications wanted the rights to Superman and looked down on its creators. They talk about Paul Levitz admits on camera that he would have been a little more careful when it came to the decision to publish The Dark Knight Returns, which was obviously a huge hit and everybody talks about it today. They talked about Milestone creators, and now the DC executives told them basically they couldn't sell black comics. I think that is such a more interesting and focused story. But that's just me.
All that stuff was so much more interesting to me than like what felt like a sizzle reel towards the end of this documentary, where it was like, we all love Aquaman, right? I'm like, what? What are you talking about? Yeah, I there was one moment, and I don't remember if it was in episode 2 or 3, where they were talking about DC moving from New York to Los Angeles,
right?
Where they were like, had to fire a lot of people. But anyway, we're so psyched about LA, and I was like, whoa, what? You want to flip it and reverse it about all those people you fired?
The thing that I found weird about that is that they cut it, and the voiceover narration was done in such a way that it made it seem like the layoffs came before Batman v Superman, and so Batman v Superman was the reason that they made all the layoffs. That is not even the case. The layoffs happened in 2020, 4 years after BVS was released, but they made it seem like those movies were the reason that they had to make those cuts. And if I know it correctly, and somebody let me know if I'm wrong, but that was not the case. So some of the editing was really sketchy.
Now DC, just like Marvel, is going all in on movies, and so they have to move to LA. And sure, we fired a lot of people, LOL. But the movies are gonna be fantastic. And I was like, I feel like we're skimming over some stuff right there. But that's kind of how I felt about some of the stuff in the later part of the movie, where they're like, we can't talk bad about anybody who's like currently involved or like was working for it. So like we gotta really skim the surface. We just gotta toss a rock and it's gotta make it like to the middle of the pond, right? Like you don't want to go too deep on any of these topics. Whereas like the first couple episodes were willing to be like, and DC dropped the ball on this, DC dropped the ball on that in the 70s or the 80s or the 90s were kind of a rough time for DC, where like Vertigo saved them, and then no one gave Vertigo its respect. And I thought that was interesting. And then you get to like the part 3 and they're like, but everything's great now. You're like, okay.
Well, they did mention one thing that didn't go right in that third episode, and that was the 2017 release of Justice League.
Yeah, I was surprised. I was actually like, a live look at my face was like, uh-oh. They're going into that, because I would have bet you $100 that they weren't touching that with a 10-foot pole. And the way they did it was like, yeah, maybe just leave it out then.
Yeah, well, there was a bit of news that came out before this documentary or this docuseries was released. The director of the docuseries wanted to use footage from Zack Snyder's Justice League, but Warner Brothers said no, that there was only one version of Justice League. So what I thought was
super weird.
I'm just going to tackle this head on. So what I thought was weird about the mention of Justice League is that they're like, yeah, BBS came out. They don't even mention Man of Steel at all, even though they showed a lot of footage from that movie.
They did. Yeah, they did show a lot of footage from Man of Steel, but then they were like, movies.
They talk a lot about Wonder Woman. They don't mention Patty Jenkins is like, it was hard to get them to make a Wonder Woman movie, and she never puts it out there that Zack Snyder is pretty much the reason that she was allowed to make a Wonder Woman movie, because he and his stunt team created a sequence to show them what the Wonder Woman movie could look like, and that's what they like greenlit it off of. And there's video footage of that. I will link it into this video description, starring Samantha Wynn at the stunt woman as Wonder Woman. So I kind of wish that they had mentioned that, but of course Zack Snyder doesn't get any positive mentions in this in it at all. But they talk about BBS and they talk about Wonder Woman, they talk about Justice League, and I'm just going to say Justice League because that's what it is. But they never mention, and I thought this was so weird because like you and I both know what happened with that. But if you're just a regular Joe Schmo and you have no idea what happened with this, you're not going to know what the heck they're talking about. They never mention why Justice League failed and why fans rejected it. They don't talk about the reshoots. They don't talk about the horrible treatment of the cast. They don't talk about pushing Zack Snyder out and bringing in Joss Whedon. They make it seem like it was just Zack Snyder's movie when it totally wasn't. They don't say why Zack Snyder needed to realize his original vision. They talk about the Snyder Cut getting released, but they don't talk about why it had to be released. So I don't know how you can mention this without explaining why his original vision never got out in the first place. And then they call it a recut, which it never was. It's how the movie was supposed to come out. The Justice League version was a recut. So
Rebecca's hot about this one.
I could not believe it. They didn't mention that Zack Snyder's Justice League had a better reception when it came out versus what happened in 2017. They didn't mention any of that.
It was one of those things where I was like, listen, I get like from a documentarian, if they know it's going to be on HBO or they know it's going to be on Max or whatever, it was probably commissioned by WB at some stage of this documentary. I don't think it was like independent. I can understand them being like, listen, this whole situation, it's kind of awkward. Like people are still involved in it. Like there's a lot of hurt feelings. Maybe we just don't mention it. I feel like that is a better tack to take than what they did, which is like to kind of mention it, but not give any context whatsoever. Like, I would think that at the very least, if you're trying to give like the most silver linings version of the event, you would at least say like the fans clamored for Zack Snyder's
because they think all of the Snyder fans are toxic, horrible people. They're never going to say anything nice about us.
They didn't even say that. Like that's how I wanted to avoid a very complicated like a hurt feeling situation on a lot of sides. I'd be like, okay, maybe if we have to put this in, like we can massage it so that it sounds like a win for us. But they didn't even try that. They were just like, and also this version. Anyway, moving on. Black Adam. Have you seen Shazam 2? I was like,
I just thought
Okay.
it was so unbelievably disrespectful to the man who made them billions. I mean, I'm trying to think. Definitely millions, maybe borderline on billions if I would have to calculate. Like, made them billions of dollars through box office return, through DVD and Blu-ray sales and digital sales, merchandising. That Zack Snyder made them a lot of money. There was a WB executive who actually tweeted about that recently, that he made them a lot of money, and they never even gave him the respect to be like, all right, we'll feature, a Zack Snyder interview where he's talking about, the wonderful mythology of DC Comics. Because I know those interviews are out there. They didn't even put him
I'm
in.
sure. Yeah, I'm sure that they have clips from the press junkets, just like everybody else's weird, disconnected clips that they could have put in. It was very strange. I thought that they would. I honestly, going in, was like, they're probably just going to steer away from the Zack Snyder stuff entirely, just because it's awkward, and now they've got James Gunn, and they're like probably just going to like go straight to like this new vision. But they went a different direction, which was like to kind of mention it, but not quite give any yeah, you're right. If you didn't know, if you weren't a big fan and you did not know what was going on with the DC universe at that point in time, that would have this documentary would have given you no context, and you would have been like a little confused, like, wait, why did they need to release a director's cut of it?
Yeah, what was
What?
different? What was different
Why
about
would
it?
they do that? You're not going to get answers here in this documentary.
They also don't mention that Zack Snyder cast Gal Gadot and cast Jason Momoa. They sort of skimmed over that stuff. Not that you need to put all that stuff in there, but it's just such a disrespect for somebody who did so much to further DC on film and make them a lot of money. I found was just so strange. So
Yeah, I thought it was weird. It's like, I feel like you want to go one of two ways. Either you actually discuss what happened and discuss, it as part of DC's history, or you don't mention it. Or just skim right over it, I think, because the way that they did it was like, I guess we should mention this period of DC history, but I don't know really what to say about it, and I don't want to hurt anybody's feelings. So
we don't want to talk about the reason that we made them go to the November 2017 release date, and we didn't want to push it back because we really wanted that bonus check. That's the reason that we did that. We don't want to mention that because that would make us seem like greedy dirtbags.
Corporate profits are really important to us here at WB. So,
and that's a true story. They wanted
I
to.
no, I no, at no point did I question that.
They wanted that bonus check.
That feels right. That feels correct. Yeah, it's weird that they were like, again, I think to me that the drawback of this documentary is that they were really willing to talk about how DC had messed up, but only in the past. Like, once you got to like the 2010s, they were not willing to say anything. And at that point, like, just leave it. Just leave it. You're already squeezing 85 years into 3 episodes. Maybe just go with like the origins, and then just like do a quick clip compilation at the end and be like, we're still going, and then just go out from there. Like, the 3rd episode, I feel like, because it was focusing on modern day, but I don't feel like they were willing to like dig into it in like the nuanced way that they were when it was like something that happened in the 90s or something that happened in the 60s. Like, when it came closer to present day, they weren't going to give you like the pluses and minuses of how it's going. It was just all great.
Yeah, I mean, not to belabor the point, but they didn't even mention the 2009 Watchmen film, which is now looked upon very fondly.
I think they
and
didn't they?
They sort of like, it was like a blip on the radar, but they focused more on the Watchmen TV show at the very end of the 3rd episode.
Oh, yeah, they did.
But Watchmen was considered by director Terry Gilliam unfilmable. And then Zack Snyder filmed it, and it's actually now looked at 10 years later or actually 14 years later, as a very great film, and they didn't bother to mention that.
I think
either.
that was like one of the issues with the documentary, though, is that by casting a net so wide that they're talking about, the Watchmen TV show and the Watchmen comic, but also like Superman, Batman, Wonder Woman, all these characters, and also the films and also the TV shows and video games and like, you know what I mean? Like there's no way that they could squeeze all that, because then they also talked about like the stuff through like from Vertigo. So that's like
An Image. They
an
talked about-
Image.
Mhm.
Yeah, they talked about the a lot of guys going off and creating Image, and they talked about Vertigo and like the more adult centered comics that they started putting out in the 90s and things like that. So Sandman and things like that is of documentary about Vertigo could be probably like a 3-part documentary just by itself.
Yeah.
And it got, maybe 10 minutes in this documentary, but it all felt so condensed and squeezed down to the point where it's like, if you know the Wikipedia of like any of these topics, like you probably know more than what was in this documentary.
Yeah. There were some things that I think they also sort of maybe they just didn't have time for it, but some of the things that they either mentioned or failed to mention was strange to me. So like when they were talking about the Death of Superman comic book storyline, they didn't mention that was timed together with the wedding of Lois and Clark on Lois and Clark: The New Adventures of Superman
that's
TV
right.
series.
Well, they
And
don't
they-
even mention that the Lois and Clark, the TV show.
And they portrayed the creation of the Death of Superman comic book storyline as a desperate attempt to get the attention on the comics, which, to my knowledge, and I fact checked this with Michael Bailey, who knows more about Superman than anyone I know, that was intentionally created in order to tie the comics to the show. That was not like a desperate attempt to get people to read comic books anymore. It was a thing to get attention to the comics, but it was more so them trying to synergize between their different formats. So I thought that was weird that they didn't talk about that.
I also thought, I mean, we talked about this again off without during the technical difficulties after show, but I I don't know why I expected them to mention Smallville at any point, and I don't know why I'm angry on its behalf. Honestly, that show hurt me so much. And yet I was angry on its behalf. I was like, wait a minute. You're skimming. They showed it on like a timeline of like DC stuff, and they panned past it, and you saw Tom Welling, and I was like, oh, cool. We're gonna talk about. No, we're not. It just panned right on past, and they're like the new era in the Arrowverse, and I was like, what? Excuse what? That show was on for 10. That show took 10 years of my life. You go back and you give it a clip, a sad little clip.
And it went on for 10 seasons because Warner Brothers wanted a 10-season box set like the Friends set. That's a whole other thing. But they had 2 perfect ways to include Smallville if you were going to do it. They talked about 9/11 and the DC Comics response to 9/11, which I thought was actually interesting because I've never read that compilation that they put out, and
neither have I.
That 9/11 tribute that was an homage to the big All-American comic book. That was one thing I learned. I didn't know about that. So they could have talked about the 9/11 stuff because Smallville came on pretty soon after 9/11.
Yeah, right after that.
And they could have talked about how Superman was a good, a way to cope with the changes in our world, and how we needed, a character who was built on hope and was a heroic figure at that time. That's what, especially the American people needed. They could have talked about that because that's historical. That's tied to that historic event. I mean, it came on right after. And then they could have talked about it preceding Arrow. They could have said something like, due to the popularity of Justin Hartley's Green Arrow, WB in the CW wanted to further, Green Arrow's popularity in another show. They could have tied it in that way, but they never did.
I thought it was going to be like the second one. I thought they were going to be like, before the Arrowverse, there was, there was Smallville, and then that led into the Arrowverse for the, same network even. But no, they just kind of rack panned over an image of the season 1 box set from Smallville, and off we were. That was like the biggest mention of it. And I was like, oh, okay. I don't think they even mentioned Lois and Clark at all. And the only reason this was weird is because like they did spend quite a bit of time on some TV shows. So they talk a lot about was it the 60s or the 70s version of Batman?
66.
Yeah, the Adam West version of Batman, and how was like a goofier version of Batman. I mean, as a child, I took it dead serious. I was like, this is a great quality entertainment.
This is a great dramatic show.
I see no comedy here at all. Bam pow. I was like, I want to be Catwoman. That's very obvious. But yeah, they talk about that. They talk about the Wonder Woman TV show, as they should, as we've seen. It's incredible. From the pilot that was like 3 hours that we watched.
The pilot has one of the slowest fight sequences ever shot on TV.
It's incredible.
Yeah,
stand right there while I punch you. And like they talk about the George Reeves, and they spent more time on all of those. And it was like as they got to like a more dense period where there was more DC stuff in terms of films, in terms of TV, in terms of video games and comics and all of that stuff, they were like, okay, we don't have time to like talk about all of this. It's not possible. So like, let's just condense everything down to like a 10-second soundbite, and then we'll just move it along. We'll move it along. And I was just like, I mean, just make it about the historical stuff then. You seemed so much more interested in that stuff.
It was weird too, because Terry Hatcher's Lois Lane was a pretty big phenomenon back in the day. Wasn't she at one point when the internet was created, like the most downloaded picture on the internet, the picture of her in Superman's cape?
I think so. Yeah, I remember that being like that coming out, that was like the most downloaded.
You had to download it like pixel by pixel.
Pixel by pixel. You're like, come on, Terry,
you're waiting like 3 hours for that thing, but I guess it was worth it to some people. But that was a pretty big phenomenon back in that time period. So it's weird what they chose to focus on and what they didn't. I mean, they talked about Super Friends, and so it was kind of strange what they were picking and choosing from.
It was one of those things where it's like, I understand that like the breadth of this documentary doesn't allow for it to talk about everything. But yeah, there were certainly some choices made, like of what they weren't gonna even touch and what they were gonna actually like talk about. And I guess you could argue that the animation portion was also very underexplored in this documentary. I don't think that there was very much about the animated shows at all, except for maybe like Batman the animated series. But there was also a Lois and Clark or a Superman animated series that I don't know that they even mentioned.
They didn't touch it. Yeah, Marcy Dalmatian in the chat asks, were there any segments in the film about DC animation? Yeah, it was basically just Batman the animated series. Nothing about Justice League or Justice League Unlimited. Nothing about the animated cinematic universe with the DC animated films. Nothing like that. So it was basically, and I understand why they talk about Batman the animated series. It was the first of them. It was a big deal. It's seen by most people as like the definitive Batman. Kevin Conroy is the definitive Batman for a lot of people. It also saw the creation of Harley Quinn in that animated series. So
they did talk about that a bit.
Yeah. So there's a lot there to talk about with Batman the animated series. But yeah, I mean, that's all they talked about.
To me, it felt a little bit, and I don't know if this is just me being jaded, so you'll have to tell me if you also felt this way. But to me, part of why I feel like they talked so much about Batman the animated series versus any of the other animation was because they could be like, that's where Harley Quinn came from. And Harley Quinn, Margot Robbie, she's still in these movies.
She's in a recent one directed by James Gunn, who is now helming the new DC universe.
That's why I was like, oh, that's why we got so much about Batman the animated show, which I watched when I was younger and I loved. And I was happy that they were like highlighting it and talking to some of the creatives behind it. But then we got to and then they created Harley Quinn. And I was like, okay. That's why we're here.
Not only is she played by Margot Robbie, but she's voiced by what's her face from The Big Bang Theory in a new
Kaylee
yeah,
Cuoco,
Cuoco,
which you
in
can
an
also
animated series.
find on Max.
Max.
Which, listen, the Harley Quinn animated show is legitimately great and very funny. Not safe for children, but very funny for adults. But so I have no problem with them highlighting it, but it did feel like they highlighted it because they were like, and you can watch it now.
I will say that was one of my more favorite parts of the documentary, but I also think this was probably like a behind the scenes featurette from like
Yeah.
a Blu-ray. But I really enjoyed seeing her do the voice acting because
That
I have
was really cool.
I have
yeah.
such a high respect for voice actors because I've tried to do it and it's hard. You've tried to do it. I mean, we
It's very
the
hard.
two of us have attempted it to varying degrees, I guess, of success. Morgan is way better at it than me.
I
but-
don't think that's true. I had to spend like 5 minutes trying to find a voice. But I thought that was so cool in the documentary where you hear the director go, "Okay, that's great. Could you do it like a little bit more like this?" And you see her do another take of it,
And
which
she
is
nailed
so
it.
cool. So
She
cool.
nailed it. Yeah, I thought that was great.
Yeah, that was really, I forgot that they showed that behind the scenes stuff, and that was really cool. Like stuff like that, I feel like that's okay. That's something I haven't seen before. I haven't seen them like do the voice acting and see what goes into that. But like, yeah, like bringing us in that way, that felt like something that I couldn't just, YouTube a press junket and get the same clip from.
Yeah, I thought some of that was good, but I could feel the promotional material in it. I think I liked the first episode and maybe parts of the second episode the best because those are the two episodes that really dug into the comic book creators and what
Yeah.
the world of DC Comics was having to do in order to evolve and change with things. I loved when they brought in Barbara Friedlander, who is the writer of Secret Hearts, and this may be something that we might need to research because Secret Hearts was a comic book title within DC Comics, as far as I understand it, but it's also the title of the fictional TV series that Linda Danvers is on in the Superman family comics. So Supergirl was a soap opera actress in the Superman family title on the show Secret Heart. So that when I realized that there was an actual comic book title called Secret Hearts, I was like, oh, is that the same thing that the TV show is based on? But I loved hearing the stories of so DC Comics is mostly known for superhero stuff, but Secret Hearts was like a romance series where it was about, young love and things like that and sensitive characters. And then it talked about how there was this famous image from the Secret Hearts comics of the drowning woman that got stolen in 1962 by this guy who like recreated it and then made a lot of money off of it.
So yeah, that I'm glad you brought that up because I had forgotten this part of the documentary almost entirely. But like when you started talking, I was like, oh yeah, I loved this part of the documentary because it was fascinating and it was not something that I knew about, which is usually what I go to documentaries for, right?
You learn something, yes.
Tell me something I haven't heard about, or tell me about a cult. And or both. But this one I didn't realize. So they were talking about the artists who did Secret Hearts, and they're showing some of the panels, and I go, oh man, that art style looks incredibly familiar. Why? The reason why is because Andy Warhol would then go on to be inspired by these panels and would create these giant pieces of pop art, which became iconic and also made him very famous and very rich. I mean, among other things that Andy Warhol did, of course. But these sort of pop art was kind of his thing. But I thought pretty messed up that the artist who did it originally didn't see any of that money.
Yeah, the original artist on Secret Hearts was a guy named Tony Abruzzo, and the guy who stole it for the pop art, which I think Andy Warhol did some of that, but the guy specifically in this instance was
Roy
Lichtenstein. Yeah.
Oh, you're right. Andy Warhol did some other paintings in the sort of that style.
Yeah.
But Andy Lichtenstein, or Roy Lichtenstein, was the one who basically recreated it. And it's so funny because, it's thought of, it's got its own Wikipedia page, Drowning Girl.
Oh wow. Yeah.
And it's it should the credit should go to the original artist who did that work. And in lieu of that, you would think that when it became very famous, I don't know, I personally would have kicked back some of that money to the original artist, but
Yeah, it's unfortunate. They basically talk about it as artistic theft and how it really ruffled the feathers of a lot of artists in the comic book community because they were like, our stuff can get stolen. Like, this is what do we do about this? So I thought that was actually a really interesting section of the docu series. I really enjoyed hearing. I think my favorite parts. I think I've mentioned this before, but just getting the stories behind the people who did things in the comics specifically. Like they talk about Karen Berger, who is the executive editor of Vertigo, who brought in those British invasion creators like Grant Morrison and Neil Gaiman. I thought that was really interesting.
so cool.
I really liked the stuff with Jeanette Kahn and how she thought about comics a little differently and how they got into the trade paperback and the graphic novel game to try to get people to put comics on a shelf and have them
And
be a little more permanent.
I think that those things also made me think, I feel like there's like a whole, it was so interesting to me that there were these women in comics, which is not usually a very friendly, not always a very friendly environment for women, especially back in like the 70s. And she was put in charge of this comic book company. And I was like, oh man, I bet the stories about that are insane. Like
Which could be a documentary in itself.
that's what I was thinking. I was like, I want that documentary. I want the Vertigo documentary. I want the, the documentary of her like having to get these guys to listen to her, because I'm sure they did not want to. And I thought that was so interesting. Like here is like this, this big comic book company, but they've had a lot of women in really prominent positions at time periods when that was pretty rare. But they did kind of highlight that, but they didn't really go into backstories or I immediately was like, oh, tell me more about like this and this. And they were like, okay, moving on.
Yeah, the Jeanette Kahn and what was the other lady's name? Karen Berger, and then Diane Nelson. They talked about her. She's the one who decided to create DC Entertainment and put all the DC stuff in video games and kids TV shows and all this kind of stuff and the Lego movies and all that kind of stuff. And I think it would be really cool to hear stories about women comic book creators, women executives who made really big changes to the company that were very positive. Diane Nelson, in my opinion, is the only good DC Warner Brothers executive who has ever been at the company because she actually had like a vision for things that made sense and was actually a positive result, even though she had to make that tough decision to lay off all those people in 2020. But for the most part, I thought she did a pretty good job and had an actual idea of what things could be. So I think that's such a more interesting story to tackle because you could make that more focused. I just wish this docuseries had a little more focus to it.
Yeah,
It felt like it was all over the place.
I think if it had been longer with its current focus or more focused with its current length, it would have worked. But I think trying to go through 85 years of history in comics, in TV, in movies, in video games, in animation, it's just it's not possible to do justice to a lot of these stories. And I think that the documentary did a good job on some things and then did completely skimmed over or just missed other things entirely just due to the runtime. And I wish that they had decided, okay, we're going to focus on DC entertainment, like the movies and the TV shows, or we're going to focus on the comics, which is kind of what I was hoping it would be. And we're just going to tell those stories, because I do feel like when they were more focused in on some of the stuff, they would tell some interesting stories, but then it would kind of, but then it needed to, also touch on a bunch of other things. They're talking about, going all the way back to like the 30s, back like to the current day. It's just like not possible to, get deep into any particular thing. And I wish that they had focused it in a little bit more so that we could have like learned a little bit more of those like deep stories that are kind of more what I come to documentaries for, like, because it's more interesting.
Yeah, it did skip time periods quite frequently, which made it a little jarring. It was great the way they did it. I mean, the actual visual of the,
Yeah, very
thing,
cool.
like that was pretty cool, but it did take a lot to sort of reset my brain to like focus. Okay, now we're in the 40s. Now we're in, 1990s. I did think that early on when they sort of start the docuseries with the creation of the creation of DC Comics with the creation of Superman. And then they go to the creation of Batman. Then they go to the creation of Wonder Woman. And those I thought were really strong because it told the stories of the creators and why they chose what they did and why they made the decisions that they did. But they stopped at Wonder Woman. They didn't go into like the creation of the Flash and how he came to be, or the creation of Aquaman. Why did they decide to do that? They didn't keep that going with the characters. And I guess it was due to time, but it seemed like that would have been a way more interesting because I don't know anything about the creation of Aquaman. I don't know anything about why they decided to do that. They and they sort of talked like a wee bit about like Swamp Thing, but they never mentioned like big comic heavyweights like Len Wein, who's such a big notable DC Comics creator. The co-creator of Supergirl and Otto Bender. He was a major player back in the day. They talked about how Captain Marvel outsold Superman back in the day. That was because of Otto Bender. So there are things that they didn't talk about with those early comic book creators that I thought really they could have spent time on. And I think those would have been really interesting stories to tell because the idea of where those comics came from, where those ideas came from is really interesting to me. And I felt like they sort of dipped their toe into that and then backed out. They talked about some of the major storylines, like the Green Arrow and Green Lantern road trip across America, which is kind of a cool thing. But
that made me want to read that. I was like, listen, I don't usually care for Green Lantern. We all know this. But
this has been an established fact.
But he's going on a fun road trip. That could be cool. Yeah, I mean, I like that they did also, like, they talked about some of the big events. So like they talked about Crisis, and then they talked about like the New 52, I believe.
Right, Flashpoint and the New 52.
Flashpoint and the New 52. But yeah, I would love to know more about like what went into those decisions. Because they did touch on it a little bit in the documentary, but I'm sure that there's like a lot more interesting backstory there.
Yeah, they touched on a little bit about how the fans were confused by the New 52 reboot, and I was like, confused is maybe not the right word for that. I think fans are mostly upset because that was the era that they really sexualized Starfire and Catwoman, and they changed basically everybody's story except for Batman because you don't mess with Batman.
Don't touch
Batman. Have to keep Batman like he is. Batman is the only thing that works for us. Do not touch him.
We know we got Batman.
So I don't know if it was necessarily that fans were confused by the New 52. I just think fans didn't like the New 52, but they sort of couched it in a more friendly way that made them look somewhat good. It was this
I did
big
think
and
that
bold
was
daring thing.
I did think that was funny because I vaguely remember when the New 52 stuff was happening and everybody was like, "Oh, this."
That's kind of what it was.
And in the documentary, they were like, some fans loved it and some fans not so much. Anyway, moving on. Okay, interesting. I like when they would show as part of the documentary like old footage of like man on the street interviews from comic book stops where the one guy was like, I don't know what they're doing killing off Superman. Hopefully he comes back. I was like, I love that guy. I hope he's doing great now.
There was one guy who seemed really sincere. He was like, I don't want him to die. I really like him. I don't want him to die. And I totally bought that.
I know. I felt that. I felt that. I see Marcy Dalmatian in the comments said, there was a time in the 90s when the comics industry was having a hard time. Comic shops closed across the country, and Marvel filed for bankruptcy in 1996. DC wasn't doing well either. I thought that was a really interesting part of the documentary where they talked about like almost the creation of comic book stores, because
Yes.
the way that they used to, and this is something I wasn't really aware of, or like only a little bit aware of, but basically they used to just sell comic books in like grocery stores and
Right.
like newsstands.
Yep.
And not anywhere else really. And then grocery stores started to be like, we don't want to put up these like spinning racks with your comics. And they're like,
Taking up space.
And it was so funny because they're like, what do we do? Like, this is where we sell them. If we can't sell them here, how do we do it? And then they talked about like the creation of the independent comic book store, which really kind of saved comics. But then also like the dark side of that, which is like this comic book collectors boom that happened in like the 80s, 90s, where comic books, you know, the number one of comic book, you know, Superman or whatever, Spider-Man would go for thousands and thousands of dollars. And so everybody was trying to just collect the comics to be able to sell, like resell them, not necessarily for love of the game. They talked to this little kid. God bless this kid. I love this kid so much.
He was good.
They were like, what do you get? And he was like, I hope it's worth a lot of money. And they're like, do you want to read it? He's like,
He was like 9. He couldn't have been more older than 8 or 9.
That kid was an entrepreneur.
He's a billionaire now.
He's a billionaire now. Elon Musk. But so they talked about how, like, basically as boons usually go, there's a bust, right? So the bottom fell out of the comic book collector market. And that really, really, gave them a hard time in the 90s, which I thought was super interesting, where they were saying, like, in the 90s, some of the Vertigo titles were kind of saving them because nobody was trying to, I'm going to sell my Sandman numbered 5. And, like, no, everybody's like, okay, I'll give you $5. So the people who were actually buying those comics were buying them to read them because they were interested in the story, not because they were hoping to flip a profit like they were doing with some of the superhero titles. And I thought that was fascinating. Like, so stuff like that to me was what was really interesting about this documentary, because like I wasn't really reading comic books in the 90s, so I didn't know about this like time frame and like the comic book boon and like the collectors that everybody was just trying to collect them to, like, you know, flip a profit like a Beanie Baby. But look how that went. I have a whole garbage bag of my investments as a child somewhere in my mother's house. But yeah, no, I thought that was really interesting. And like, that's the kind of stuff that I thought this documentary did really well.
Yeah, I really enjoyed the transformation of the comic book industry anytime it had to grow and change within itself to continue to sell comics. I thought was really interesting. There was also another point when they talked about Superman the movie, where they talked about how that was a period of slump for DC Comics. And so when the Superman movie got made, that sort of gave them a resurgence. I did not know that. That was not something I was familiar with in terms of the time period of the Superman movie. So that was something I learned. But now I'm also kind of questioning it, because they're like, well, when BVS was happening, that's when DC laid off a bunch of people. And I'm like, that's not true, though.
I mean, honestly, also, those layoffs happened in 2020. Feel like that's a pretty important context. Can't imagine what else was happening in 2020 that could have affected like a...
No mention of the pandemic whatsoever.
Yeah, it's so funny.
Which would have been historically contextually relevant.
Yes, because when you mentioned like, oh, the layoffs happened in 2020, I was like, oh, did they? Okay, well, that makes a lot more sense. Feels like that little bit of context would have really helped.
Yeah, I thought the comic book ness of the docuseries I thought was way more interesting than some of the other stuff. Just because I think it did an effort. It did make an effort to go into it and really dig into some of these creators. The only thing I didn't like about the creator aspect of it is they they were kind of misleading about the Joelle Jones stuff too, because they gave her the lower third writer artist for Wonder Girl, and I was like, they're making it seem like she created Wonder Girl. Like Wonder Girl has been around since I can't remember.
No, she's just doing the newest run, right?
I know. Well, I know, but she's doing the Yara Flora version of Wonder Girl, but Wonder Girl existed since 1965 with Donna Troy, and so they made it sort of seem like she had created this brand new character, and I was like, yeah, but she's kind of a ripoff of this other character that was created in the 1960s. So I thought that was a little misleading as well. So while
it felt like they could have given context to some of these characters where they could have been like, okay, this is a new twist on this character or that new twist, but like again, I felt like a lot of it was a victim of the runtime and just trying to shove things in. They were probably like, we got Joelle Jones to talk to us.
She is gonna do it.
She said she's gonna do it. She's gonna do a little drawing for us and everything. We're gonna feel like we're there talking to an actual person.
Yeah. So when I'm like, oh, this is an interesting fact I learned, and then I'm like, oh, but what if it's not true because that other thing they said was not true?
I was like vaguely true, but not in a real way. Rachel wants to know which Wonder Girl, Donna or Cassie, or the new one.
Well, the one they were talking about in the documentary was the Yara Floor, which is the most recent
the newest
one.
Okay.
But that's the one she was drawing. But I just thought it was a weird thing that they made it seem like she had created the concept of Wonder Girl, which is not true. So that I thought was very misleading.
Yeah, because I figured out that they meant like the newest version. But then again, like I have a certain amount of comic book knowledge. But like if you're just somebody who's like, what's DC all about? And you decide to watch this documentary, are you going to come away thinking that she just full sail created the character? Maybe. They weren't very clear about it, were they, Bunsen? Oh, Bunsen, what's up, buddy?
He is loving these Supergirl Radio live and wired streams.
Has been loving the live streams lately. He's been living for them. He doesn't like to be on camera as much as his brother. He doesn't like to look directly at the camera.
He just wants to be present.
He just wants to be present. He wants to get some pets. He wants to bite a wire, perhaps, if that's available to him. He will take that for sure. Come here, buddy. Why don't you show everybody yourself? Oh, look at how pretty you are. Say, oh, I learned so much about DC, but not as much as I wanted.
They did talk about the super pets.
They did. They did talk about the super.
Well, no, they didn't mention the super pets.
Oh, they didn't. That's right. Well, they had a movie they could have plugged.
Yeah, they did. It was actually pretty good.
We liked it. Yeah. Lulu forever. All right, buddy. All right, buddy. I'm going to let you down.
Nice.
That was great. Time. That was some great Bunsen time. I like how he just lets me pick him up, but he like goes dead in the eyes when he just does that thing where he just flops and he's like not going to like move any part of his body. He just goes limp. He's like, I'll let this happen, but I want you to know I don't like it.
Yeah. Well, I guess one of the last things I wanted to ask you, Morgan, was that Dan DiDio talked about how his competition, he thought, was not against Marvel Comics. That the competition he was aiming to go against were the film and TV show and the animated adaptations of the characters, because he felt like if they became the voice of those characters, the comic books would be lost. So I was curious, Morgan, what your thoughts are on the competition between the comic books and the adaptations in different media.
I honestly thought that was interesting because I thought it was weird. Because it seems like the live action stuff, the animation stuff, can bring in new comic book readers because they see a Supergirl TV show and they're like, I love Supergirl. I want to let's get into her stuff. Let's read her books. I think their problem in the comics, in my opinion, is that they're not beginner friendly. Like if you watch the Supergirl TV show, or you watch the Flash movie, and you're like, who's that chick that got killed 100 times? And you just want to know about it. Where do you start? Where do you start with comics? Like, it's so hard because they, the titles are a little bit complicated, and they restart, and they're like, no, don't start here, start here. But when you start here, you're gonna want to cross-reference Superman 525. What? And then people they give up. It's too hard, and they give up. So I feel like making the comics a little bit more beginner friendly for the people who watch a Batman movie and go, I want to read a Batman story, or see Superman and want to jump on board, or watch Supergirl and want to see what the stories are based off of. Honestly, get off the wire. That I think would
She's not talking to me, audio listener.
No, I'm sorry. Bunsen, audio listeners, Bunsen has decided that what is his passion, what he needs to do in his professional life, is to bite my headphone wires. It's happening off screen, so the viewers aren't seeing it either, but it is quite annoying. He's going to ruin these headsets for me, and then it won't be a Windows 11 situation. I'm gonna have to buy a whole new set of headsets. But yeah, I think that they can capitalize on the new people that they're bringing in from TV and animation. I don't know that I think that those people necessarily have to be like that. Those mediums have to be competition with the comics.
I can see what he's talking about, that the comics should be the main source of what those characters are. Like, I get that. But I think at the same time, they keep talking about all the ways they were growing and changing, and they were taking all these bold new directions. And if they want to move with the times, like they said they wanted to, sometimes that is a TV adaptation or a film adaptation, whatever it is, in 2075.
Buddy, I beg you. Where do you want to be? Where do you want to be? Do you want to be over here? I'll make a spot for you. Great. Now you're over here. Why don't you sit down here? I made you no, not the wires. God, not the wires. Please, Bunsen.
Does he not want to sit on that little spot behind the computer that he had?
I thought he might want to. It seems like what he wants is like the good scritches that I'm giving him. He's liking this situation, but he also desperately wants to chew through a wire. So that's his cross to bear for tonight, and we're gonna hope for the best for him, because I need these headsets. I need them, Bunsen.
Please,
he doesn't
don't chew through that. Yeah, I kind of thought it was strange that they would talk about. I mean, I wrote down a whole bunch of quotes. If you will indulge me.
Oh, of course.
They talked about the boldness and creativity of DC, and how Paul Levitz talks about creativity requires courage. And let's see. Paul Levitz also talked about The Dark Knight Returns, saying it's a book that defied all the conventions of what we had done previously. Each individual decision there was pretty courageous. He talked a lot about being courageous in storytelling. Let's see. Karen Berger wanted to do stories at Vertigo to shake things up, and that broke with the status quo, and that challenged people's perceptions of what a comic story could be. I mean, they just went on and on. Garth Ennis, writer of Preacher, said comics have to be allowed to do anything, to go into whatever territory any writer or artist deems appropriate. Jim Lee said, when the characters have been around for 80 some odd years, you can go two ways. One is to be traditional in your approach, or you could chart a different path, which is to really try to revolutionize the universe. So it was, it made me think, well, if you want to revolutionize things, if you want to chart these new, bold, creative, courageous paths for yourself, why couldn't that be in a film? Why couldn't that be in a TV show? So I don't see the competition, but I understand from his perspective, Dan DiDio, as an executive DC Comics, he probably saw, the billions of dollars that the Dark Knight trilogy was.
Oh, I think you're muted.
I unmuted. Am I back?
Yes, you're back.
I don't hear myself.
Oh no.
Hang on a second.
More technical difficulties.
Somehow I got unplugged. I guess it was my rant. Sorry. Okay,
I'm
now I hear
surprised I'm surprised it was you and not me, since Bunsen has been aggressively rubbing himself against the computer. If my angle has changed, it's because he's moved the computer like 3 times with his head.
I just got
loving
a little talking with my hands, and I knocked my microphone out.
Always
But-
dangerous.
Yeah, I tend to talk with my hands. But I just think it's something where if you write good comic book stories, people will watch the films and the TV shows and read the comics. So I think that's the thing that I would tell them, is to focus on writing good stories. I know that seems really basic and simple, but I feel like that is the answer to a lot of things.
Yeah, no, I agree. I mean, I do sympathize that, like, yeah, I can imagine it's hard to see like some of the movies making like millions of dollars and the comics don't, are struggling to sell, but it's a different medium. People don't read as much, unfortunately, and I think it's tough. Some people don't take comics seriously, and some people would say, oh, I wouldn't read those are for kids. So I feel like, yeah, they do have sort of a little bit of a hill to climb in terms of getting people to start checking out the comics. And obviously storytelling is a really big part of that, and telling a great story, word of mouth can really grow and things can really take off. I mean, a lot of these movies that have done really well, were based off of specific comic books. So,
Right.
We talked about the Watchmen movie, which is obviously one of the probably greatest comics of all time. But, even some of the Batman movies were based off of like specific runs on comics. So maybe marketing that even better, like the tie-in a little bit better. Like, hey, did you like this movie? Like,
Go read
Go read
Nightfall. Go read The Dark Knight Returns. Go read oh my gosh, No Man's Land. No Man's Land is actually great. Everybody should read that. So yeah, I mean, they definitely could tie that big in, and I think to a degree they try to do that sometimes, but it's not something that's as good as it could be. But I think
I was gonna say, I thought it was really cool how they talked about the dawn of the graphic novel as being like, why should these single issues just kind of disappear? Let's put them all together so people can catch up. And I think that was whoever, I can't remember who they said that was like coming up with that idea. I feel like it might have been
it might have been
one of the executives.
It was I think it was Jeanette Kahn, and who was the chick at Vertigo?
That's what I was thinking. The woman it might have been one of the women at Vertigo. What was
her name? Karen Berger. I think it was Karen Berger and Jeanette Kahn, because Karen Berger talked about how Jeanette Kahn was an influence, an inspirational figure for her as an executive to make big decisions. And I think it was the two of them that sort of helmed that graphic novel trade paperback era, which is how I kind of, now that I think about it, like I did have my friend Mike who gave me a lot of his old comics. He was a big Teen Titans fan, so that's how I know about Wonder Girl and things like that. And my laptop might be going dead.
Oh no!
I've frozen up. If I go away, I will come back if I need to. Can you vamp?
I can vamp. Don't worry.
Let me see if I can come out and come back in. I don't know why that happened.
We appear to be still having technical difficulties. This is fun for all of us.
Can you still hear me though?
I can still hear you. Yeah.
That's really weird.
It's very strange.
All right, let me come out and come back in. I think I can leave
without ending the stream.
Yes.
I think since I'm still in, it might be okay.
Okay, I'm gonna try to leave.
Sure. Yeah, no, I thought the documentary did do a lot of things good. From a Supergirl perspective, and Rebecca, I'm sure we'll talk about it when we get back, but they did, they included some footage of Melissa Benoist. Now, I don't think they interviewed her for this documentary. I felt very much like it was like B-roll from like a featurette, like a Supergirl featurette or something like that. But thank you for putting yourself on the correct side. I was like, no.
It feels weird.
I can't be over here on that side. I was just saying that they did include Supergirl, though not much of her in this documentary. They included an interview with Melissa Benoist, though I suspect it was from one of the Supergirl featurettes.
Yes, I've seen that before, and she was obviously in costume, so it
Yep.
would have been while they were shooting it in production. So they talked about how Supergirl was, part of the Arrowverse and how it kind of went from Arrow to the Flash to Supergirl. But it didn't really talk about her much after that.
Not really. They did. Melissa Benoist did drop the hope, help, and compassion for all motto, which is nice.
Yeah, Sterling Gates would be proud.
Gates, good. They didn't talk to Sterling Gates.
Oh my gosh! Why
No,
would you talk to Sterling Gates?
No,
Why
well,
would you do that?
Don't talk to comic book writers we want to hear from. I also saw another Supergirl character pop up, although not mentioned and just in passing, much like Smallville. But Dreamer was included
in a piece of art,
Pride lineup piece of art, and I went Dreamer, and that's as fast as she was on the screen.
Came and went. Not even mentioned by name.
Immediately gone. But I I did like that they talked about having LGBTQ characters within the DC universe, and they had Greg Berlanti talk about how he related to the superheroes from that perspective and things like that. And they talked about, I think, like the recent is it Jonathan Kent?
John Kent, yeah.
John Kent,
Jonathan Kent is the curmudgeon-y
Jonathan. No, John Kent coming out is like bi in the comics and things like that, which is what I believe we saw Dreamer in one of his books.
Yes.
A couple of
Son of Kal-El, maybe?
I wanted to say a couple months ago, but I don't think that's true at all. I think that was like last year.
It was probably a while ago. It feels recent to us.
It did. It's recent in my heart, but not in reality. So I like that they tried to highlight that. Again, they were doing so much in this documentary. Not a lot of time to really talk about a lot of this stuff.
You could do a whole documentary based on just the social aspects of the comics.
Oh, absolutely.
I mean, I really enjoyed them talking about the American propaganda during World War II. They talked about how the politics in DC Comics has been there since the beginning. That is true.
Yeah.
The social justice aspect, if you will, of that has been there since, Action Comics #1. That is true. And they kept talking about, oh, we have to do this. This is so important. It's so important. And all I could think was, yeah, but the stories have to be good. You can't just do it to do it. The stories have to be worth reading. And I think sometimes that gets lost in that conversation. It reminded me a lot of Supergirl season 6, where it's like, we've got to do this socially important episode. And then the episode is garbage, and it's like, you could do it, sure, but it's gotta be good.
Yeah, it's like the Supergirl gun control episode where everybody watching it is just like, what were you try? I don't think you might have undermined your own point somewhere in there. But yeah, no, I agree. Like, representation just for representation's sake is not always the best, but representation is super important. And I like that they talked about the comic book characters and also stuff behind the scenes of like trying to how hard it was for like a person of color to go in there and get a superhero made that looked like them. And I thought that was really cool and pretty powerful. And they kind of like, this is like, they talk a little bit about Black Lightning, although not the TV show, ironically. They just the comics. Did they? I don't remember if they showed any clips from the TV show.
I want to say there was maybe a clip in there, but
when they were talking about Black Lightning, and then it's like a blink, and I don't remember it being very substantially like mentioned, but I thought that was like really, really cool that they like highlighted those stories, because it's part of the DC story too. Is like how hard it was to get. How hard it was to get characters like that on the page. Even Wonder Woman, they were like, they weren't sure Wonder Woman was going to sell. Like, who wants to see a lady doing action things?
And part of it goes back to that idea that the executives have to believe in it. Part of the reason Milestone Media didn't succeed the first time is because the executives were like, I'm sorry, we can't sell black comics. It's just that's what we can't do it. They could have been like, we're gonna get behind this, we're gonna do a real big promotion, we're gonna reach out to some of these communities who could be interested, we're gonna find the audience where they are, and we're gonna sell them to them. And they made no effort and they just gave up.
I thought that was like a really interesting point about sometimes when people say, well, the audience wasn't there and we had to stop, which is what the creators of Milestone were saying was like, if you're not getting any support, if you're not getting any marketing, how are you then going to expect it to succeed? Like, you wouldn't expect, another book to go out there with no marketing and no executive buy-in behind it and then do really well. Like, why would you stack all these cards against us and then be surprised when it wasn't going great? And I thought that was really interesting. And like, yeah, exactly. If they're telling them right to their face, like, we don't think this is going to go well. And like, shock that it doesn't, that they had to close. I think they closed down within like initially the first time, like within 4 years. And it's like, of course, because like the DC executives were telling them straight to their face, like, we don't think it's going to work.
That's why Batman is so successful. They're like, we are into this.
We love Batman.
Are promote everything having to do with
What do you
Batman.
believe? We believe Batman. We believe in him. We believe in Harley Quinn. Yeah, it's very funny. Yeah, even in this documentary, so much Batman. They love Batman.
And they were like, and Michael Keaton returned as Batman. You could just mention there was a sequel. Like, they mentioned, and Michelle Pfeiffer's is Catwoman. It's like, yeah, but you didn't even talk about her Catwoman. You just mentioned her like it was a big deal, and then you never spent any time on it. It's so weird.
Funny. Yeah, it's so funny. They did mention like the 89 Batman, like the Tim Burton Batman. But something else that I would have loved them to have gone into more, because those Batman movies were weird.
I love them.
And I would love to know more about like what went into. They do talk to the one guy, and I think he was
Michael Uslan.
Yeah, where he was like, I watched the TV show, the Batman TV show in the 60s.
Yeah.
And I was like, this is wrong.
They are making fun of Batman.
I must save Batman. And then he was like, I bought the rights to Batman. I was like, I'm sorry, sir. He's like, I was 21 years old and I bought I might be exaggerating. He was like, I was in my 20s and I bought the rights to Batman. And I was like, and you're a millionaire? He was like, nope, I had like a stick of gum and a dream. I was like, man, the 80s sound amazing.
He is one of my favorite success stories. He sees Batman 66 and he's like, oh yeah, I'm so excited about this Batman show. And then he watches it and he's like, oh, they're making fun of Batman. I don't like this. And so he spends the rest of his life trying to get the rights to Batman so he can correct that and make people take Batman seriously. And they did. And he changed it. I just think that is so awesome. So aspirational. What a story. I love his story. And you will see his name in every credit of anything that has to do with Batman because he owns the rights.
That's amazing. I love that for him.
He was like, never again will Batman be made fun of. I love his story. Yeah. So I guess, Morgan, if we were going to wrap this up, we've talked about a lot of things, which seems fair.
Like the documentary.
The docuseries talked about a lot of things. I guess, what are your closing thoughts on what you watched? Did you think it was something you would point to someone who doesn't know anything about DC Comics?
Maybe, because it's a pretty expansive overview on DC Comics, and I came away from it like having a lot of being like, I want to know a lot more about this thing. I want to know a lot more about that thing. I want to know a lot more about this other thing. So I feel like as like a gateway into like the history of DC, it's pretty good. Like, it's a pretty good 101. It gets a little less good towards the end, I will say. But as like the historical stuff up into like the 2000s, it's it's pretty solid, I think. And yeah, it was too much history to cover in too little time. But I think that they did a pretty good job of like giving you a good feel for the different places that DC was in, and DC, and how the company started and like ramped up, and like how important the different characters were. So yeah, I think overall I enjoyed it. Do I think it's like the definitive DC documentary? No. But I thought that given how much they had to cover and the time constraints, they did the best they could. They probably could have dug deeper into some of the stories earlier on and then just kind of skipped all the stuff at the end. And I would have thought, man, what a good documentary. I feel like the last episode was like when you get towards more current day, it just becomes like a corporate reel, like a that you're watching, where it's like
they showed all the shareholders.
Yeah, exactly. Shazam. And I was like, okay, that's awkward. Some of it's definitely not going to have aged well. It didn't. This came out in July. I watched it in October. It didn't age well from that period of time.
It showed the Flash and Shazam 2, Black Adam,
a whole new generation of DC heroes. It's like flop, flop, flop.
Every single one of them.
It's like, oh, that's brutal. That's hard to watch. But yeah, I think that the early stuff in this documentary is very solid, and lots of interesting stuff that like I probably will look into. I'm like very fascinated with like the Vertigo stuff and how that all came together, and like the early history and like the comic book stuff. I kind of wish it was just a comic book documentary, but that's me putting my perspective of what I wanted, like more onto the documentary. The stuff I feel like I was most interested in kind of was the comic book stuff. And I feel like that stuff was really well done and interesting and kind of more in depth. And then when they went to some of the other mediums, they were just kind of skimming over the surface.
Yeah, I think if you knew nothing about DC Comics, this would at least give you some entry point into that history and be able to give you some appreciation for where they came from, where the comics and the stories and the characters came from. I think it's very promotional material towards the end, which I didn't care for, but there were some things that I learned about it. I didn't know much about Vertigo. I haven't really read any of the Vertigo stuff, so this made me really interested in the Vertigo stories and why they were so important at the time, especially when it first came out and gave people a new kind of comic book to read. I'm actually interested in checking those out. I also didn't know about John Ridley's series, The Other History of the DC Universe. I'm curious. I'm curious. They talked about that as a series where he was taking storylines for the past and sort of reframing them from a socio-political thread.
Oh, that does sound interesting.
Through the prism of DC superheroes who came from historically disenfranchised groups.
That sounds more focused.
Yes.
That sounds like a documentary with a focus.
These are comic book stories.
That's really cool then.
No, this is, as far as I understand, these are comic book. It's graphic novels. There's a
you're right. I forgot that they mentioned there was a lot in this documentary. I'm so sorry. I forgot that they did mention that. Yeah, that sounds really cool.
Yeah, it's a 5-part series. I don't know. It'd probably be too political for me, but I think it's a really interesting concept, and that was something I didn't know before this documentary. So it actually taught me something to go check out. Maybe I'll read that Green Lantern, Green Arrow road trip title that I've never read. So maybe that'll inspire me to do that. I think it faltered in terms of the structure, I think, and the fact that it had no goal. It had no perspective. It felt like there were parts that were directed by Warner Brothers where they were telling you not to use these things. And so it didn't feel that authentic, I think, for me. But I think it's something, if you've never learned anything about DC Comics history, I think it gives you at least an intro to it. I was thinking about, yes, go ahead.
Sorry, I thought you were done.
I'm never done.
I have feelings. I saw a kind of an interesting question in the chat from Stanley, who said, "Did you think they covered the fan perspective enough in this documentary?"
It was mostly the perspective of the creators and the executives.
Yeah, I would say. Well, it's so funny because at the end of, I want to say it's at the end of part 2, but I could be lying. I watched this a week ago, and there was a lot in there. But they kind of do like a cliffhanger where they're like, the people who are going to save DC are the fans, and then I don't feel like they really got into it too much. They were like, fans really like it. Okay, yeah. I mean, I got that from the word fan. That they really liked it. Yeah, I felt like they were like gearing up to talk more about the fans and the fandom, and then they just kind of skimmed it like a lot of the other topics.
Yeah, they showed a lot of Wonder Woman cosplayers that were,
Yeah.
doing the
Really
crossed
cool-
arms,
really
with
cool
the gauntlets.
cosplays.
Yeah, they were like, show all the fans from San Diego Comic-Con, and they're like doing poses and stuff. And they didn't really. The only thing they talked about regarding fans were the New 52 Flashpoint reboot and how people were kind of iffy about it. That's really all they talked about.
Yeah, they really made it feel like, okay, the fans saved it, and then I was like, oh, that's fascinating. How? And they were like, fandom. It's like, oh, you want to be more specific about
That
how
would-
the
Now
fans
that would be
saved DC?
that would be a cool documentary too, is to talk
Yeah.
about because fandom has changed. Early on in DC Comics, they were making like fanzines, that kind of thing.
Yeah.
And then fans would write into comic books to say, well, I didn't like that
Their-
last
their
comic book. that
letters
you-"
pages
Yeah,
and things.
Yeah, so that would have been how fans would have communicated with them. Julius Schwartz was a guy who would have focus groups on his stairs in front of his house, where he'd be like, "So, 8-year-old girl, what do you think about this Supergirl comic?" And so that was how he decided storylines.
That's
and then
amazing.
And then you get into the era of, say the Adventures of Superman TV show with George Reeves. That was a big explosion of fans where they had Superman merchandise, and he was shilling for Kellogg's cereal and doing all that kind of stuff. And then you get to Superman the movie, which was an even bigger explosion of fans. And then you get into the internet age where there's message boards and Reddit pages and YouTubers and podcasters, and you could make a documentary about that, and that would actually be awesome.
Yeah, just about fans. I see Marcy Dalmatian in the chat said there's a couple of documentaries about Comic-Con, which include interviews with fans. So yeah, there's stuff out there. But yeah, I was hoping for a little bit more when they teased it, like the fans saved the day. I was like, oh, cool. They're gonna get into maybe a little bit of background on DC fans and that kind of stuff, and it not much. I would say if you're hoping for the fan perspective in this documentary, that's not necessarily. Are you a fan of Warner Brothers corporate? You'll get that perspective. You're gonna love this. From a fan perspective, a little bit less so. I mean, they do have that one guy who was like, I was really sad when they killed Superman. So they have stuff like that. I was hoping that they would show more footage from comic shops in the 90s, though. That's really all I want is that passion.
Those are so good. That one guy was like, yeah, they can kill him. I don't really care about Superman.
that I was like, oh my God, all of these guys and girls, legends, these people.
They had just finished a game of D&D in the back of the comic book shop. And so now they're just being interviewed by Superman. No, I was just making that up. I don't know if they were playing D&D.
I do want to give Aaron's perspective is correct also. Aaron says you can't show the fan perspective because we're not one thing and there's no real way to paint an accurate picture of what the fans are.
I think it is. You could show Supergirl Radio.
Yeah, exactly.
I think we are.
We have a whole community. We feature your comments. Look at, we're doing it. The documentary could have done it. I think that's a point that the fans, DC fans are not a monolith. But I feel like they could have taken like a nuanced perspective of Sam. I mean, they kind of did in the documentary, but like specific to like the New 52 or like the Death of Superman, where they would have like one guy being like, "Wow, I don't care about Superman, kill him," and then be like the other guy going like, "Oh, not Superman." We could have done a little bit more of that.
I think it would be really interesting to show how fandom has changed for comic books.
Yes, I think that's interesting, like how fans gathered together and how they communicate. Like that stuff is so interesting when you think about the pre-internet era of like how fans got together and talked about their favorite comics and things like that. I think that kind of stuff would be really interesting. I wouldn't come to this documentary for that. That's not really in here.
Not for the fan perspective.
Could you imagine if they were trying to do that in this documentary also? They're like, we got comics, we got TV, we got movies, we got video games, we got animation, we got all the fans, every fan.
And video
3
games.
hours.
Did you mention
3
video?
hours. I mentioned video games. I'll never forget. They're like, and then in the video games, I was like, video games too? You're biting off a lot that I don't think you can chew in this documentary.
Yeah, this one was a lot. I would recommend. Last week I was trying to think of different if there were other DC Comics documentaries, and then over the week, since we had a week to gather ourselves, there are 4 that I would recommend. That if you've never watched, The Amazing Story of Superman, that's the one that I think came out before or in connection with Superman Returns. It's a kind of a complete up into that time story of Superman. There's also a documentary about Batman the Animated Series called The Story of Batman the Animated Series. Then there's also behind the scenes of the Dark Knight trilogy, and then one that's just about DC Comics called Secret Origin, the story of DC Comics, which I believe I saw mentioned in the chat by Aaron saying I saw another documentary that's called Secret Origin, the story of DC Comics. Yeah. So I think there are other ones to look up if you want maybe a more focused history.
There's also
is that Beaker?
Beaker, he's definitely going to jump to the top of this china cabinet. That's what he's about to do. Beaker, buddy, do you want to maybe come over and see your audience? Look at them.
Oh, hey Beaker.
No,
he can't hear me.
Buddy,
he can hear me.
Oh, buddy.
He's going to do it. Oh my gosh.
He's meerkatting. He is meerkatting right now. Buddy, hey, what if you didn't do that and you did something different? Anything different at all, buddy? He's not sure if that's what
has he tried to do it before? Has he attempted it?
I mean, he has gotten up.
Has he broken things?
I'm just worried about the glass vases up there.
Do you need
no, he's done it. He has done it. He is up there, up on the top of the china cabinet. He's made it.
I'm so shocked that he did that without busting anything.
He's actually usually pretty good at not knocking things over unless he wants to.
Wow.
The question I always have to ask is, does he want to? Buddy? Hey, bud, what if we got down?
Wow.
Beaker, you cannot jump from there to there. It's not possible.
That's amazing. Audio listeners, you really need to go watch the video.
He is my cat Beaker is now on the top of my china cabinet. There are some vases on top of there too. He has not knocked them down yet. So far so good.
Wow.
I don't know what he's thinking though. He's looking all around in a way that makes me suspicious and scared. I don't know what he wants to do.
He's got to be in the high level so he can see his kingdom.
Everything the light touches is his kingdom. So that's correct. That's also I guess he's just gonna chill out back there. So video listeners, you can enjoy that. Audio listeners, you should be watching. Apparently,
you really should. That was incredible.
It was quite an elegant jump.
So full of tension. I was on the edge. He
thought about it a little bit. He got up on his back paws. He went down again and back up.
He really calculated.
There was a ramp up to that. Yeah. He was beautiful minding and his doing the calculation.
He did the math perfectly.
He did. I wanted to point out, I believe it was Marcy Dalmatian who also said Comic Book Superheroes Unmasked is another documentary about the history of comic characters. It says Neil Adams and Stan Lee were in it. And then also Look Up in the Sky and You Will Believe. Both documentaries feature interviews with the cast and crew of the Superman movies. One topic they talked about was the creative decisions, good and bad. So
yeah, there are some good additional DC related documentaries out there. Stanley asks, any good Supergirl documentaries or historical books? That is a good question. The Flash movie has a short documentary about Supergirl that features Sasha Calle, Laura Vandervoort, Helen Slater, Melissa Benoist in there. So that's kind of a Supergirl documentary. It also features Sterling Gates in there
Ooh.
talking about Supergirl, but not even in full length documentaries about her history. I would recommend, and I would like for us to talk about it on the podcast because Morgan, I'd be curious about your thoughts on it because I think he is such an interesting guy. I have a schedule to talk about the book Otto Bender, The Life and Work of a Comic Book and Science Fiction Visionary.
Ooh.
He is Otto Bender's one of the co-creators of Supergirl. And so it's not a book about Supergirl, but it's a book about one of the co-creators of Supergirl. So it really informs his interest in it informs why he would be interested in creating a character like Supergirl. It's a very good read. There's also an audiobook version, so it makes it easy to check out. But nothing specific about Supergirl's history. And Morgan, at some point in my life, I want to wrangle you in trying to write a book.
Oh my gosh.
About Supergirl's history. Because I think I could bring a lot of the historical facts.
Yeah.
But you're a better writer than me. So I figure maybe we could team up and write the definitive Supergirl history.
Oh my gosh, that'd be amazing.
Who better to do it than us?
Who better? we got some projects going.
So I would like to do that. I hope that Supergirl Radio at some time in the future is the one and only historical book, the definitive history on Supergirl.
I love it. We're setting our sights high on this podcast.
Let's see. New Rachel recommends the book Voices of Krypton by Edward Gross for all things Superman. I have thought about it, but to be honest, I listened to some interviews he did. There was one in particular that he did with Batman v Superman by the Minute, and that guy totally misinterpreted Batman v Superman. And it reinforced my thought that some people just don't understand cinematic language. And I think he's one of those guys. Because there's a sequence of BVS where it's called the Day of the Dead sequence, where people in the news are talking about Superman and sort of debating his existence. And there's a scene or a shot really, where Superman's high up in the sky and this woman who's in a flood is looking up at him. And it's like painting him as this godly figure in the sky who's come to save her. And the Voices of Krypton guy is like, that is such a bad interpretation of Superman. He would never do the blah, blah, blah. And I'm like, but that's not the actual that's not actual Superman. That's humanity's perspective of Superman. That's how we see him. That's not how he actually is. So I was like, I don't know if I can read Voices of Krypton because that guy clearly cannot interpret films. But from what I understand about Voices of Krypton is that he interviewed a bunch of people and it's just this big anthology. No, it's not an anthology. It's like a bunch of recordings of interviews like typed up and put together. So I don't know what you would call that. What kind of book that is?
Like an oral history, maybe?
Kind of, yeah. I think that's the Voices from Krypton, Rachel says. So I think that's kind of what it is, a big oral history. But I've also heard it badmouth Zack Snyder in a lot of cases. So I may pass
maybe
on
not
that one.
For you.
I may pass on that one, but I know he was making the rounds interviewing people. So the BVS by the Minute guys were nice enough not to call him out on saying something really stupid. I'm sorry, but that was stupid. Anyway, so that's a book you can check out if you want to. So there are some historical sources out there for you if you're interested in those kinds of things. But if you haven't seen Superpowered, the DC story, let us know, watch it and let us know what you think, because I guess it's definitely something to talk about. All right. Well, I think that is going to do it for this episode of Supergirl Radio. So now we need to get to some Supergirl Radio and some DCTV podcast plugs. If you would like to contact Supergirl Radio, you can post a comment on our website at supergirlradio.com. You can email us at supergirlradio@gmail.com. If you'd like to leave us a voicemail, you can call us at 678-718-7252. You can like us on Facebook and follow us on Twitter and Instagram, all at Supergirl Radio. You can listen to us on Apple Podcasts, Stitcher, iHeartRadio, Google Podcasts, Radio Public, Podchaser, and Spotify, where we also have a Spotify playlist that includes music featured on and inspired by the CW Supergirl TV series. We are listed on DC's fan page, which you can find at dccomics.com/DC-fans. If you like what we do, we encourage you to give us a rating and write us a review on Apple Podcasts. If you enjoy our Supergirl Radio live streams, make sure to subscribe to the DCTV Podcast YouTube channel and hit that notification bell to get notified when we go live and wired. DCTV Podcast also has a TeePublic store, so if you're in need of new DCTV related t-shirts, tank tops, sweatshirts, onesies, mugs, notebooks, pillows, or stickers, go to supergirlradio.com and click on the TeePublic store link at the top of the page.
Now see here, Supergirl Radio is part of the DCTV Podcast Network, so if you want to listen to other shows, we've got The Flash Podcast, Legends of Tomorrow Podcast, The Lituation Room, DC on HBO Max Podcast, Stargirl Podcast, Superman and Lois Radio, Green Lantern Podcast, The Sandman Podcast, DCTV After Dark, and Justice League Dark Podcast.
And I think I put it in the wrong order.
I was about to be like, oh, wait a minute.
Let's get the order right in the doc.
Oh my gosh. I was like, everything's crazy. We have some comic book designs in the DC TV Podcast TeePublic store that we would love to suggest.
Yeah, we have some things about the Comics Code Authority, which
they mention. Yeah,
they mentioned a little bit, which they sort of acted like it was well, I guess at one point they were like, yeah, some of this maybe was a thing, like some of it with Wonder Woman. Yeah, maybe they were right about that. But so we do have some things in the DCTV Podcast TeePublic store about comics, and if you want to check that out, head over to, you can find the link to it in the you can go to supergirlradio.com and click on TeePublic at the top of the page if you are interested in that. And we would like to thank our Legion of Super Sponsors for supporting the Supergirl Radio Patreon. These people are Michael, Anne-Marie, Yvonne, Quinn, Nicola, Abby, Miriam, Nicole, Brian, Ethan, Danny, Majuba, and Lingonberry. If you'd like to become a Legion of Super Sponsor, you can go to patreon.com/Supergirl Radio. We have some monthly membership levels or tiers there, so we appreciate you supporting the podcast. If you would like to catch up with me, you can do that a couple ways. I'm on Instagram at the Derby Kid. I'm also on a social media platform known as Vero. You can find me at Derby Kid over there. That's kind of where I share what I'm watching, what I'm listening to, if I'm reading something, which is very rare. But I think I posted recently that I had just watched The Bishop's Wife, starring Cary Grant, which I had never seen, and I love Cary Grant so much. So I needed to make sure that I watched it. And I thought it was a little weird that the angel in that story was like hitting on the bishop's wife. I felt like Cary Grant maybe went a little too far there. If I was very uncomfortable about that story. But all ended up well, I guess, in the end. But it was a good film, and actually very interesting. Like effects wise, I thought they did some pretty cool things for early in that time. You can also subscribe to my personal YouTube channel at youtube.com/duckmilkprod. Haven't been active there lately for a while, but I'm working on some things. Maybe in November when I have some more free time, I'll get some new content up there. But that's where you can find me as well.
And you can find me on Twitter and Instagram at Mojotastic. And you can also find me as a co-host on the Legendary Ladies podcast, where we had a special guest star Phil on for the last episode to talk about Bride of Chucky. We are in spooky season right now. It is the spooky session time. Our next episode dropping will be me, Kat, and Phil breaking down our top 5 horror movies. You might ask yourself, why wasn't Amy on this one? First, she is in a sold out show, I believe, at of Sleepy Hollow.
Nice.
So she is Katrina in that show. So she's deep into rehearsals and things like that and doing the shows. But also, I think she's only seen 5 horror movies. So her top 5 would have been kind of pre-decided.
I understand that.
She's like, I think I've only seen 5. So I was like, okay, maybe not the right episode for you. But me, Kat, and Phil had a fun time geeking out about weird horror stuff.
What's your top one?
Spoiler alert, it was actually The Ring, because that movie traumatized me in high school for real. I tell the story, I think, on the podcast, but this was back before you like reserved seats at the movie theater.
Yeah.
Gen Z, imagine it. You just go in and you hope to find a good spot. And
were
so
you right up in front of the screen?
We were the first row
to
see The Ring. When that little girl climbed out of that well, it was like she was climbing right into the theater. It was not something I'd recommend seeing that close.
I went to go see The Ring one night, and I went with a friend of mine, and then we left, and then I must have gone back to my apartment, maybe, I don't know, but somebody called the phone, and like in the movie, the premise of The Ring is like if you watch the VHS, and then later
You get
somebody
a call,
calls you,
and then they tell you how many days you have to live.
Yes, and so like having just seen that movie and then getting a call, it like freaked me out. I was like, can I just I need to watch like something funny. I'm just gonna put on like a TV show or a funny movie or something, because it really did.
I slept with the lights on for a couple of days.
Tough to watch. It was tough to watch.
That is a scary movie. And for the rest of our top 5 lists, you'll just have to listen to the Legendary Ladies podcast. But
I'm curious.
That was really fun.
I'm curious what 2 through 5 is.
There was some overlap on all of our lists, which I thought was pretty fun.
What's your favorite Scream movie? Do you have a favorite one?
Oh, so I will say that Scream was the one movie that was on all of our lists. But the original.
Yeah, that's really the only horror series that I really like.
So good.
Because
it's very meta.
And it's about filmmaking, essentially.
It really is, yeah. Especially all of them kind of, but like the first one I do feel like was like, this is what a horror movie is, and these are what slashers are, and this is what you can expect. You have the character who's like, if this was a movie.
Yeah. Yeah, I think the original Scream trilogy would be like, I haven't watched a lot of scary movies outside of that. I watched Interview with the Vampire when I was in high school.
Oh yeah, I remember that one.
Is that a horror movie? I don't know.
I mean, technically
it's got vampires.
It's got vampires, so it's in the genre, but I don't think it's a very scary movie.
Does it have to be like a slasher movie?
No, okay. I don't think it. No, ours sort of went over. I mean, I think Kat's had a few more slashers on it. Mine had I kind of like a little bit more of the supernatural horror.
Yeah.
So I had a little bit more ghosts and spooks on mine.
I can't do some of those things. Exorcism movies, definitely no. I'm not doing that.
Oh my god, we watched. Speaking of, Mike and I watched The Pope's Exorcist last night.
Oh, is that the new one?
The new one with Russell Crowe. It was actually pretty good, but if like that kind of stuff freaks you out, probably not best to stay away. It was pretty. There were some moments where I was like, "Oh, this is freaky."
I've been listening to a podcast called The Exorcist Files.
Ooh,
and they do
that sounds scary.
It's a priest who actually talks about his exorcism, like his examples of his exorcism. I don't know what, like him going out and doing exorcisms is what I'm trying to say. And they do it so well with like the audio.
Oh God,
that is just audio. It's an audio podcast.
Yeah.
But when like demons are saying stuff,
They do the
terrifying.
the sound design and stuff
I couldn't sleep for a week. I was like, because I binged it, and I just can't. I can't do some of that stuff.
Have you ever seen The Exorcist?
No, but that's based on a true story. Yes.
That movie is freaky. Yeah, I believe it is. Yeah. I went to Catholic school, so obviously it was even scarier for me. And then I was in like middle school, and we were all like around the TV at like a sleepover or something watching The Exorcist. I don't think any of us slept that night. We were like anything would happen, we were like scream. Not the age that you should be watching that movie unless you have like very hardcore nerves.
Yeah, I'm not. The older I get, the more I can't watch scary movies.
That's fair. It's like, you know what? Life's scary.
I used to be way about it when I was in high school, but I can't do it anymore. But I would agree with you that The Ring is the most terrifying movie I've ever seen.
I'm glad that CM Gutierrez in the chat also said The Ring was terrifying. I couldn't sleep for a week. No joke. Yeah, I literally when I saw it the first time, I slept with the light on. I'm trying to get Mike to watch it one of these spooky seasons, and he's like, I don't think I want that.
I don't think I've seen The Ring since it came out. I can't bring myself to watch it again.
I've definitely seen it. You know which one I really want to rewatch to see if I have a different perspective on it is the Blair Witch Project.
I love the Blair Witch
because I feel like when I first watched it, I was like, this is kind of boring. But now I feel like I would like it. I don't know.
I've told you about the Blair thumb. We've talked about that, right?
Yes, yes.
I need you to maybe for spooky season.
I'll do like a double.
You should watch the Blair thumb. Watch it after you watch the Blair Witch, and then watch the Blair thumb.
I feel like this is like a fun spooky season double feature.
I love the Blair thumb so much.
I'll report back if I do. We can make that a Patreon.
Yes, the Blair
about my experiences with both movies.
Okay, well, I guess this has been a total off-topic.
Oh yeah, we've detoured very far away.
But that's going to do it for this episode of Supergirl Radio. But until next time, I'm still Rebecca Johnson.
And I'm still Morgan Glennon. And remember, creativity requires courage.
McGurk! I love typing.
Not mess with my Google Docs, Meeksy.
Supergirl Radio is going live every night of the week. How do you like it? Is becoming a human burrito a plus or a minus? I don't know. It does seem snug.
I mean, they say you are what you eat.
Kira. I love that.
So I do a podcast called Supergirl Radio, and one of our segments is Lena Luthor, Boardroom or Ballroom. Because
she looks like a boss in this coat.
Nasty Luthor like a different Luthor? It's not just Lena being mean?
No.
Helen Slater here. It's so fun to know that you're hosting a podcast called Supergirl Radio.
Yeah!